to meet the goals of the 2030 challenge. Oh, thank you, David. We are continuing to hold one session a month, and you can sign up for our next event at aiaphiladelphia.org. We have the past sessions archived on Vimeo and are migrating to YouTube. So we'll send these links out to you after the event. There's other great resources from AIA National on how to deliver on the 2030 commitment. There's also step 2, which is creating the sustainability action plan for your office, and the AIA has a great how-to guide. There is a list of debunked common myths or perceived barriers to joining the commitment. Again, we'll email this out after the event. I also want to review the work of the COAT Policy and Advocacy Subcommittee. We have 7 subgroups within this committee alone working on a variety of initiatives. I won't review all of them, but let's just say we have a lot going on. And if you haven't been with us, you're missing out. We have a passionate group of people that are springing into action all year round. And if you don't understand the acronyms that are listed here, join us and we'll explain. Here's an explanation of why we advocate. For example, we believe that the only way to reduce emissions is to set a price on carbon. I don't get to dump my trash on my neighbor's doorstep. I pay to have my trash removed. Why do fossil fuel emitters get to dump their waste in the sky without bearing the full cost? The answer is because the market currently allows it, and it shouldn't. The next few slides are a snapshot of the presentation I shared at the AIA National Grassroots Conference in February as a roadmap to how AIA Philadelphia and Pennsylvania are working on climate action. Step 1, teaming up. We started a committee that focused on climate policy and advocacy several years ago. This group of passionate people gather weekly on Tuesdays to strategize and respond to legislation and testify when necessary. We try not to duplicate efforts, rather amplify them when there's messages from similar like-minded groups. Step 2, reading up. We've gotten familiar with the legislative process. We've dusted off our civics lessons from grade school. We also like to make it fun. We created this fun dynamic visual mind map tool using Google Slides that our committee uses weekly to organize our discussion and our research on current issues. We really work to understand the relationship between the different scales of government, local, state, regional, national. Step 3, level up. We've worked our way to becoming experts that legislators seek out to help review new policy. You can and must use your voice to make a difference. Because of the amazing work by our state staff and the compelling written testimony we made during the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI hearings, AIA was invited to several Department of Environmental Protection roundtable discussions to review how RGGI funds will be spent. You'll hear more about RGGI during Senator Comitta's remarks. Here's a snapshot of a few things we've been involved in throughout this year. You can see what you're missing out on. There's just a lot going on. In case you missed our newsletter, last month featured a snapshot of the Carbon Visuals website describing the scale of emissions for individuals and for the entire city of New York for one day, that image on the right that you see there. You really need to sign up for this newsletter. You'll continue to miss out on these great resources. And you can also follow us on LinkedIn and also on Instagram. So you can see we have a lot going on. Whether you're an architect or a member of the public, we need your help. Please consider joining a subcommittee. And I want to end with the motto I largely stole from Mark Allen Hughes, the first director of sustainability for the city of Philadelphia. When making zero carbon buildings that cost less to operate and are healthier and better for all, make them simple, fun, and required. Making overcoming first cost is simple and can be simple. Make volunteering and learning fun. We'd like to think we do that. And make zero carbon required. When a client asks, do I have to do this? Wouldn't it be great if the answer was yes, you can, and you must do it. So here's some key steps. Again, we'll email this list out following the event. Thank you for listening. Again, if you want to receive AIA CEUs, fill out the Google form link that was entered into the chat window. And we'll take questions again after Senator Comitta's remarks, but please feel free to enter your questions at any time. Now I'm going to pass the microphone over to Steve Krug, who's going to introduce our speakers. And Ed, I will pass the screen sharing over to you. So take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Brian. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers. First, Ed Mazria, the 2021 AIA Gold Medal winner. I first used Ed's Passive Solar Energy book when I was early in my career doing a few projects, as well as in graduate school. He is famous for his natural daylight buildings. And I remember seeing Ed in Portland, Oregon at an AIA conference together when he unveiled his, I think it was around 2006, when he unveiled his 2030 challenge, which he created. He continues today to push our industry of architects towards net zero. I serve as chairman of the Climate Change Advisory Committee at the state of Pennsylvania, and we are pushing our initiatives towards this as well, with recommendations that the governor and legislature are considering. I'm also pleased to announce an old and good friend of mine for many years, Senator Carolyn Comitta. We've known each other since teaming with her husband on a number of projects. Her husband, Tom Comitta, is a planner, and we've worked many times together. She also served in my community as the borough council member, the mayor, as well as state representative, and is now serving as state senator. And with that, I will let Ed begin the presentation.
Okay. Thank you all for having me here. Welcome to all the AIA members, other members, the 2030 districts members. We have 3 districts in Pennsylvania, which is the most of any state. Can you, just want to make sure, can you see my screen? Yeah, okay.
Yes, so we can. Yep.
Let's begin. So this is an old saying by a famous Yankee baseball catcher. If you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. So we need to know where we're going. So what does that mean? We keep hearing about 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C. Those are 2 very different futures, and that is why we need to meet the 1.5. Let's look at what happens if we don't meet the 1.5. Just a half a degree Celsius difference, just going from the 1.5 to the 2. This is what happens. 1.7 billion more people going from 1.5 to 2 will be exposed to severe heat waves every 5 years. 100 to 400 million more people will be at risk of hunger worldwide. 1 to 2 billion more people will no longer have adequate water because of very, very hot and dry conditions, and 1 billion people may be forced to migrate. So it's critical to stay at that 1.5 and to meet that target. We all know what the problem is. It's fossil fuels. In 2018, the IPCC put out its report on carbon budgets. You've all heard about carbon budgets, but really, what are they? So in 2018, in January 2018, for a good probability, 67% chance of meeting the 1.5, you see that we have 420 gigatons of CO2 that we can put into the atmosphere. That's our carbon budget. I'll explain what that is in a minute. We've already used up, however, about 80 gigatons up until 2020. So our carbon budget as of January 1st, 2020 is only 340 gigatons for a good probability of staying at the 1.5, which is really critical. And you're hearing that now. So what does that mean? Well, right now we emit about 40 gigatons of CO2 a year. You hear back in 2015, we established a 2050 date as a phase out date. But between 2015 and 2020, we didn't reduce emissions. So now that date is no longer viable. That's 600 gigatons if we phase out, straight line down, phase out in 2050. That's less than a 50% probability, 600 gigatons. The Biden administration wants to do a 50 to 52% reduction by 2030. They still have the 2050 phase out date. I don't think they comprehend 100% what that means, but if you draw a straight line down from what we were doing prior to COVID We're now down. Go to the 50% and then follow that down. You phase out by 2040. Why is that critical? Because that gives us a better than 50% probability. And if we go even further to 340 gigatons, which the carbon budget is for a 67% chance, and then phase out by 2040, then we have a 67% probability. So a 50 to 65% reduction by 2030 is great. Hold off on the phase out date because it's going to be sooner than 2050. Okay, where's all the emissions coming from worldwide? 58% comes from 4 countries. The big 2 are China and the US, and then followed by the EU and India. So the China and the US are going to set the table for the reductions worldwide. We have a huge role to play. What the US does, pretty much everybody follows along. Well, let's look at Pennsylvania's CO2 emissions from 1990 to the latest data we have is from 2018. So you can see that emissions took a dip in 27, 28, 2007, 2008, 9. That's when we had the Great Recession. So you can see emissions went down, but then they stabilized. They didn't go back up. And then we had another dip in emissions. However, that dip, and you'll see in a minute, is due to fuel switching, going from coal to gas, little less emissions with gas than with coal. It's debatable, but this is CO2 emissions only. So we see another dip. So essentially flat, Pennsylvania's emissions. They have to drop now dramatically. Now, this is Pennsylvania building energy consumption. So this is both residential and commercial building energy consumption. You can see that both are relatively flat, up and down a little bit here and there, and but essentially flat since 1990. Now, we built a lot of buildings in Pennsylvania, and energy consumption did not go up. So every time you fuel switch and go to more less carbon intensive fuels for the building sector, then emissions comes down in that sector. This is somewhat good news. This is Pennsylvania. This is the state electricity power consumption. And there you could see that switching from coal to gas. And you could see, though, that electricity, again, has remained pretty stable since 1995, 2000. Gone up and gone down a bit. It's down a little bit now. But again, pretty stable. So we have to get rid of the coal, and we've got to get rid of that natural gas. We can't lock in that gas. So that renewables piece up top, that thin sliver, has to really grow dramatically, and we'll talk about that. 51% of the grid, which is good, actually. That is a 49% are non-CO2 emitting power. So Pennsylvania has, as with other countries, a decent start on getting to 100% carbon-free grid. We know that buildings in urban areas, in all the urban areas, buildings are the big carbon footprint. In Philadelphia, it's 72 to 75%. In Pittsburgh, it's 81%. So we know we're going to have to get a handle on the building sector. So the question that everybody's asking is, can we meet the 1.5 degrees C, especially in the built environment? Well, let's talk about the built environment. There are 3 things we need to do. We need to get a handle on new buildings, existing buildings, and then all the materials and construction and infrastructure that goes along with the buildings. So let's start with new buildings. What do we need to do with new buildings? Well, we just need to go to a zero carbon code. It's a lot easier now than it ever was. We have a zero code, 2.0. It uses a standard code, ASHRAE 90.1 for commercial buildings and mid-rise to high-rise housing. And then it just adds the renewables to get the zero. So it's not a new code at all. It uses the existing code and then adds the renewables portion. And it's just been incorporated in the 2021 IECC, and it's been incorporated as an appendix. So any IECC year code with the appendix, and the appendix can be adopted with any IECC code, will get you to zero carbon. So there's no reason now that any new building should not come in at zero carbon. Even the Chinese now just created their own nearly zero energy plus on-site and off-site renewables. And the entire EU is expected to have zero carbon codes in place this year. So what is a zero code? Well, you design an efficient building, you use an existing code. You don't have to go outside the code system. So you use an existing code, depending upon where you are and what the code, all the codes will give you a fairly efficient building now. So there's not that much after that to power the building. And then you do that with what you can on site for new buildings. And if you can't do it all on site, then you purchase new renewables. So the renewables that are attached to that building that come in off site have to be allocated to that building. What's amazing with that is that provides a stable market for renewables, because you know how much new buildings are built every year in your jurisdiction. And there are many ways. You go to zerocode.org. There are many pathways to adopt a zero carbon standard. You can do it by code. You can do it by zoning. You can do it by an ordinance. There are lots of different ways to do it, both at a city and state level, at any jurisdictional level, even a county level. Okay, so that's what we need to do with new buildings, bring them in at zero carbon. It's not rocket science anymore, and it's all cost effective. Second, existing build. What do we do with the hundreds of thousands and millions and hundreds of millions of existing buildings, both in the US, in cities, and in the world today? Well, we have to get them to zero carbon. We can make them more efficient so they use less energy. We can electrify them, and then we can use renewable electricity. And every time we electrify, then the renewables need to be new renewables for that, for supplying that building. That's the way we get it. All right, so how are we going to do this? Well, I was talking about this before. We looked at New York City. You see in those circles, those are the huge buildings in New York. That's 2% of the buildings are over 50,000 square feet. So they set that as the first benchmark in New York. That's only 26,000 buildings out of 1 million. So it's a very small percentage. It's responsible for 48% of total building sector emissions. They've now done benchmarking for 25,000 and above and want to get even further, and are doing some things which we'll talk about on how to get them to zero. But the good news is there's a small number of buildings and a small number of building owners that usually have the wherewithal to get their buildings to zero carbon, because they just have to electrify them. Most commercial buildings are all electric anyway, except maybe for district heating and getting some natural gas off the site. So we see that same condition in every city in the country. Look at Chicago, the big buildings along the waterfront, and then miles and miles and miles of small buildings. Same thing in Philadelphia, a handful of big buildings in a city, and then hundreds of thousands of small buildings. We see it in Los Angeles, we see it in Pittsburgh, we see it in Erie, Pennsylvania, we see it in Istanbul, Turkey, the same thing, big buildings in the downtown core, which is why the 2030 districts are so important, by the way. In the downtown core, then miles and miles of small buildings. Those big buildings, you set a threshold to where you get the 50% reduction, and they go first in terms of reductions because they have the wherewithal. You see it in China and you see it in Sydney. Same thing all over. So what are the policies for getting all these existing buildings to zero? So first, establish a threshold in square footage. Is it in Philadelphia, it'll probably be something like 25,000 square feet, and then above, and those buildings will be responsible for probably close to 50% of all emissions. So you establish the 50% big buildings emitters, what that threshold is, and then you develop a policy for those buildings. And what we say is require electrification plus renewables to get to zero carbon by 2030. That gives them 9 years. Usually a building will hit a capital improvement cycle by then, and to upgrade, to electrify, and then either do on-site, could be vertical solar, there's all sorts of things you can do, or bring in off-site renewables. It's not rocket science, and it's very, very doable. And the city and state can provide incentives and phased incentives for those that want to go earlier than 2030, give them fast track permitting, low interest loans, tax abatements, so it doesn't cost hardly anything to do, could be on-bill financing. There's a whole bunch of strategies to do that. Okay, what about that other 50%, thousands and thousands of buildings? Well, give them to 2040, so they have almost 20 years to get there. And then you look at intervention points to require electrification, renewables, and that could be anything from, if you go in for a zoning or use change, you're giving up something, so require them to get to zero, electrify and on-site and off-site renewables. If they're going to renovate to zero, equipment replacement, electrify. And point of sale, the new building owners coming in are buying the buildings, they have the financing in place, and they usually have the wherewithal to go to electrification and renewables. And you provide the incentives, again, same kind of incentives, so it's not a burden. That's how we get the entire built environment to zero emissions by 2040. Not only that, but if you renovate a building, you're less likely to tear it down, and that saves a huge amount of embodied carbon. That's what I'd like to talk about last here. So what about materials? What about all the materials and all the construction and everything else? There's millions of materials out there, hundreds of millions. There's actually 1 trillion products out there in the marketplace, and probably over a few 100,000 for building construction. So how do you get all of that to zero carbon? Well, that all falls in industry, and that's everything. That's from the soda cans to your cell phone to the computers, all the infrastructure, buildings, building systems, everything, escalators, you name it. It's all in that industry, and that's 43%. That's the largest emitting sector. Well, it's daunting, except if you look at it a different way, kind of like a few big buildings and millions and billions of small buildings. Well, in industry, you have 2 materials responsible for half of all industrial emissions, concrete and steel. If you add in aluminum, you're over 50% of all industrial emissions. Now, if you get those under control, the rest of the industry have plenty of time to get it under control. So what do? Well, you first have to change the conversation. The conversation is changing, and mainstream media is picking it up. Concrete, the most destructive material on earth. Well, concrete's not going to sit still for that. So they're now beginning to look at zero carbon cement. And we're starting to see that all over the planet is beginning to happen. US Steel, for example, aims to achieve net zero by 2050. We'll have to get them there a little earlier. But in the US, the great thing is we use electric arc furnaces and recycled steel. And if we get the grid to zero, then we can get steel to zero very, very quickly. And the other thing that's really interesting is that we have a competitor now to both steel and concrete, and that's mass timber, glue laminated timber. And architects are picking up on that, and it's giving steel and concrete a little bit of heartburn and competition, so they're rushing to get to zero. That's the great news. Okay, so what do we do? What are we responsible for? Well, we reuse, we can reduce, and we could sequester. To reuse, we can do everything from repurposing and upgrading urban areas. We're going to have to do that anyway after COVID. Buildings, deconstruct buildings so that we can reuse the materials after their lifespan. We can reduce by densifying. We know that density is not a COVID spreader. It's overcrowding. We could specify low carbon materials, and we could look at policy, which we'll look at in a minute really quickly. And then we can use carbon positive materials, materials that actually sequester carbon, like CO2 injected concrete and landscapes and biomaterials. There's all sorts of things coming out now, and this industry is moving very, very quickly. And your neighbor in New York State has legislation that's been introduced, And that's where they give a bidder for concrete a 5% discount on his bid price. They'll still pay him the same bid price, but they'll discount it 5% for bidding purposes if he has the lowest global warming potential, lowest life cycle analysis. And here you see that the supplier with the lowest, he wasn't the lowest bid, but now with the 5%, he gets in lower and he just beats out supplier C. So now you have, so you think supplier C and B are going to stand for that? They just lost a huge job. So they're going to make sure that the next job they bid on, their life cycle assessment is even lower. This is a race to zero by concrete suppliers. So you'll see that moving very, very quickly. And what does it cost the state? Almost nothing. 0.2% of the total job of a building to give that little incentive to lower the carbon intensity of concrete and get that program in place. So can we meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget? Of course we can. This is a no-brainer. This was Toronto in 1891. This is Toronto today. You see all those huge buildings in the downtown area? That's what we were talking about, the big buildings, small buildings. How did that all happen and how long did that take? Well, in 1925, you had the first modern building where structure moved inside and we hung the exterior wall off the building. Things were primitive back then. We had the first Model T truck. We didn't even have transatlantic calls. We didn't know TV at that time. We had radio vision. So it was pretty primitive in 1925. In 1928, the architecture community and planning community got together and said, conditions are miserable. We need to do something because we're killing people. People only live 30, 40 years. So they created zoning, got the housing out of the industrial areas, high-rise blocks, solar exposure, all sorts of things. They put forward a really utopian agenda, move structure inside so we can open up the facade and everything else. They put all that in place in 1928. It came over by steamer, an exhibit in 1932 to New York. We didn't even get the first commercial airport till 1935. By 39, you had the beautiful Johnson Wax open floor plan. And then you had glass buildings and skyscrapers, single glass buildings. These were single glass buildings, the beautiful Lever House and an entire city based on modern principles. So we changed the world, the entire world, in 27 years, and we did it with these tools. T-square, triangle, and an ink pen that we had to dip in an inkwell, and ink would get under the T-square and triangle. You have to scrape it off with a razor blade. It took years to develop a set of construction documents. Think what we can do in the next 20 years. We didn't even get the first pen till 1960 and the first laptop till 1991, and we changed the world in 27 years. And solar is now the cheapest electricity in the world. This is where we are now. To sum up, the US building sector is the success story worldwide. Our emissions are down 30% from 2005 levels. No other sector has done this. We've done it by essentially cleaning up the grid and keeping energy consumption in the building sector low due to increasing our commitments and codes. And if Biden holds good on the 2035 emissions grid beginning to phase out CO2 emissions, we should be down at least 72% by 2030 and easily phase out all CO2 emissions in the building sector by 2040. So if you haven't joined the 2030 commitment, you ought to. And if you're in a downtown district in either Erie, Pittsburgh, or Philadelphia, or want to start a new district, join the 2030 district network. They really are setting the standards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed. That was fantastic. So I see a lot of questions already bubbling into the chat, but we're going to go right over to Senator Comitta for her remarks. So, Senator, can you hear us?
So yes, I can. Thank you so much. Ed, that was wonderful, and I can't wait for the Q&A to hear the questions, and also I'm sitting here with my Senate assistant and saying we need to get Ed before the senators, and we need to talk about what holes there are in policy that we can begin to fill with legislation based on your work, and I'm sure others in the AIA. But thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you, everyone, for the warm welcome and the opportunity to be with you today. Ed, I also want to congratulate you on being named the recipient of the 2021 AIA Gold Medal. It doesn't get any better than that, I think. Pretty sure. What a tremendous honor. Thank you, Steve and Brian and all of AIA and Architecture 2030 for your ongoing efforts to make new buildings and renovations carbon neutral by the year 2030. 2030 is a big year. We keep hearing this, you know, all of the benchmarks, and we know the clock is ticking and time is running out. And so we're all in this together. When we face a global crisis like the pandemic or climate change, it's crucial that we reframe our perspective. It's important that when we face challenges, we also look for opportunities. And that's what AIA is doing. I really enjoyed the PowerPoint at the beginning and some of the work that AIA is doing, and then of course Ed's PowerPoint. And I find your approach is so refreshing and inspiring and hopeful. And, you know, as I often say to people that I work with in the field of politics, there's so many challenges, so many problems, a lot of reasons to be pessimistic. But I always remind people, in the political world, we are in the business of hope. And this is what I heard in Ed's presentation, and this is what I see wherever I look. As daunting as things are, there are so many solutions and so many people working toward the 2030 goal. I commend you for working to transform the built environment from the major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions to a central solution to climate change. As you know, in Pennsylvania, we're making progress, but we still have our work cut out for us. Every day we face challenges, but we also seek opportunities. The Commonwealth, as you well know, ranks third in total greenhouse gas pollution and is home to the fourth dirtiest power sector in the nation. But we are working through several avenues to reduce our emissions for the sake of our public health, environmental health, and economic health. First, let me talk about RGGI a little bit. As minority chair of the Senate Environmental Resources and Energy Committee, I strongly support our participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. Recently, we took a major step forward. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection released its final draft rule, and we are moving forward in the regulatory process to make RGGI a reality. Now, that's not to say there won't be a few more obstacles ahead. The majority seems committed to blocking RGGI. That includes efforts to advance legislation, Senate Bill 119, that would allow the legislature to block Pennsylvania from joining RGGI. I oppose that bill, and if it were to pass, Governor Wolf would likely veto it again, just as he did last session. But I also want to emphasize the importance of working to find common goals and common ground on environmental protection and energy policy. We know that with each passing day, the impacts of climate change grow more dire and the need to act grows more urgent. We know this is not some crisis looming on the horizon. It's happening now. And we know that 2030 is no longer decades away. In addition to addressing the severe environmental impacts of climate change, it's also so important that we highlight the public health and economic advantages of reducing our emissions and pollutants. First, let's look at cleaner air. According to the DEP, as many as 639 premature deaths from respiratory illnesses will be prevented due to emission reductions resulting directly from RGGI participation, as well as 30,000 fewer hospital visits for respiratory illnesses like asthma in children and adults over the next 8 years, up to 2030. Let's talk about a strong economy. Joining RGGI is anticipated to create and pour $300 million into Pennsylvania's economy in the first year, according to the DEP economic modeling. In addition, projections show that RGGI would add 27,000 jobs and nearly $2 billion to the gross state product in Pennsylvania by 2030. Again, clean energy and clean buildings are the way forward for Pennsylvania communities and workers and families. Our environment, our public health, and our economic health are all intertwined, and we'll all benefit from the shift to net carbon neutrality. Let's talk for a minute about the AEPS. Another important area is updating our Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards, or AEPS. I have introduced Senate Bill 300 with my colleagues, Senators Haywood and Santasero, to modernize Pennsylvania's renewable energy standards. Our bill calls for expanding the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards Tier 1 requirement from 8% to 30% by 2030. Remember, we began this journey in 2004 with the passage of the AEPS Act. While effective at that time, 17 years later, those targets are lacking and in dire need of an upgrade. In fact, they are flatlining at the end of this month. Updating our AEPs is crucial. It's a matter of just keeping pace with our neighboring states, which are already realizing the benefits of setting far more ambitious renewable energy goals. Maryland, New Jersey, and New York all significantly increased their renewable energy standards to 50%, 50%, and 70%, respectively, by 2030. And earlier this year, Delaware passed bipartisan legislation to boost its renewable energy mandate up to 40% by 2035. Again, what seems like it should be a no-brainer, and can I tell you, having been in the world of elected office for almost 17 years, I have learned there is no such thing as a no-brainer. So again, what seems like it should be a no-brainer is facing obstacles in Harrisburg. But we will continue to emphasize that the future of our economy is jobs in the clean energy sector, including clean buildings. AEPS has led to millions of dollars in local community investment and thousands of renewable energy jobs. And it will help us protect the health and wellness of all people, including the elderly, young people, those suffering from breathing problems, and other issues related to air pollution. Let's talk about environmental justice. When we talk about the impacts of air pollution and emissions on public health, we cannot ignore the reality that they have a more significant impact on lower income and urban communities. Environmental justice is a top priority in our conversations about RGGI and about the RGGI spending bill that I am currently crafting. RGGI must be implemented carefully to ensure that already disadvantaged communities realize its benefits in an equitable manner and are protected from any unintended consequences regarding potential redistribution of pollution. I think we can all agree that the move to clean energy, clean jobs, and clean buildings must benefit everybody, including urban and lower income communities. After all, we're thinking globally, but acting locally. We're talking about our whole planet and each of our communities. There are a few other bills I would just like to mention, so they're on your radar. The first is called Energy Choice. The Environmental Resources and Energy Committee recently held a hearing on Senate Bill 275, which would prevent local governments from driving building decarbonization in cities, boroughs, and townships. This bill is marketed as energy choice legislation, but it actually blocks local governments from implementing codes and policies that encourage and incentivize clean buildings. In 2019, residential and commercial buildings accounted for 27% of total US gas consumption. In addition to the need to decarbonize our economy, there are impacts to health from gas appliances. Fossil fuels emit dangerous pollutants when burned. A UCLA study found that gas stoves and ovens lead to indoor air pollution levels that exceed state and federal standards for acute outdoor air pollution in 90% of homes after just 1 hour of use. A recent study from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health examined the health impacts of combustion of all fuels for various end uses and found that in 2017, Pennsylvania ranked second among all states in premature deaths attributable to fuel combustion in buildings. That was the lives of over 1,500 people. Nearly a quarter of those deaths were attributable to burning methane. The cost of negative health impacts in burning gas in buildings in Pennsylvania was over $4.2 billion per year. Again, that's putting aside the significant impacts to the environment. As we know, buildings alone account for 39% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Another bill to keep an eye on, community solar. I am a supporter and co-sponsor of the community solar legislation, which allows community members to directly participate in and receive benefits from solar projects. Senate Bill 472 has bipartisan support. Another bill dealing with bonding requirements. At the same time, the majority is putting forward Senate Bill 284, which would saddle solar, wind, and renewable energy projects with onerous bonding requirements. So in the Pennsylvania legislature, there are a lot of moving parts, various obstacles and challenges on the path to carbon neutrality. But there is a road ahead I appreciate the support of AIA, and I'm committed to working together with you. Clean energy, clean buildings, clean jobs, and a clean environment is the way forward. I commend AIA for being at the vanguard of this movement and for being part of the solution, especially in taking a closer look at the big picture when it comes to embodied carbon and the need for urban buildings to be on a clean energy grid. I believe architects will continue to play an important and growing role in the clean energy conservation. When we talk about designing environments that are functional, sustainable, and beautiful, we know they need to be clean and have minimal impact on the environment. Architects bring a unique and important perspective to the conversation on reducing our emissions and addressing climate change. There's a lot of work ahead, but we must also look at challenges as opportunities. Earlier this year, we celebrated the 51st anniversary of Earth Day. I was remembering my first Earth Day spent picking up litter along the road to Downingtown High School, walking from my house to Downingtown High School, about 5 miles. When I think about that, it seems like a rather simple and naive problem, litter, although it is still a problem today and has grown in the oceans, and we could go on and talk about that. And we've come very far from picking up litter to gaining a greater knowledge of the environmental crisis and developing innovative ways to address it. We're moving toward wind, solar, electric vehicles, clean buildings. We have a greater understanding of environmental justice and the economic and health impacts of emissions and pollution. And we're working to implement policies that support those goals. We're working with each other, and we're working with the business community. Large auto manufacturers like GM are going all electric. The US Chamber of Commerce supports a market-based approach to climate change to accelerate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions across the US economy. BP America, First Energy, Exelon, Mars Wrigley, Nestle, Westinghouse, and more are all vocal supporters of RGGI. The United Mine Workers supports moving away from coal and fossil fuels in exchange for a true energy transition that includes thousands of jobs in renewable energy and spending on technology to make coal cleaner. So the tide has turned on this issue. While some may still want to swim upstream, the tide is getting stronger, and it brings diverse support and strong benefits across the board. Finally, last week, we celebrated an important anniversary here in Pennsylvania. 50 years ago, Pennsylvania voters ratified what is now Article 1, Section 27 of our state constitution, the Environmental Rights Amendment. It reads, "The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As a trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people." So there are two phrases that I would like to highlight there. 50 years, right? Generations to come. We are moving to clean energy and clean buildings for our children and our children's children. This is the future we are creating. And the phrase, "for the benefit of all the people." Our environment and our communities belong to all of us. The shift to clean energy and clean buildings must benefit all of us across Pennsylvania, the nation, and the world. This is the future. So, thank you very much again. I so look forward to working together with you as we work to shape a clean, healthy, and economically vibrant future. Thank you so much.